Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today I want to talk a little bit about biodiversity. What does that mean? Well, the first question we need to ask is, are there different kinds of diversity? And there are. The first kind of diversity you have in our biosphere is ecological diversity, and this is talking about different kinds of biomes, different ecosystems, and we've talked about that. And then genetic diversity, and we've talked about this too when we talked about natural selection and evolution. It's this variety that allows for some individuals to be better competitors than others. And of course, genetic diversity is what gives us new species and things like that, which brings us to the diversity that we are interested in, and that is species diversity. When we talk about biodiversity, we are talking about all the different kinds of species that you would find. And so that brings us to a couple of terms that we need to define. And the first one is complexity. When you have a high diversity, that is complexity, you typically have greater productivity and stability. And that is because each species occupies a narrower niche. There are lots more niches. And so think of it this way. If you have a puzzle that has 1,000 pieces, you can still have a great idea of what the picture is, and you can still see the picture if you lose, say, 2 pieces, right? But if you have a puzzle that's only 4 pieces and you lose 2 pieces, that's going to be a huge problem, right? So diversity leads to productivity and stability, okay? Now, when we talk about function, as you increase, you'll get to a certain point where you can't have any more function, but it's what I'm talking about. You have all of these complex interactions driving this whole system. So the bottom line is this: increasing the biodiversity is a good thing. Having a high complexity is good. And actually, ecosystems can be ranked according to the Shannon-Weiner index, and you do not have to know how to calculate this. I just want to show you that there actually is this kind of scale that says how diverse a system is, and it's actually from 0 to 4. No ecosystem is 0 really, because you've got microbes everywhere. And then the highest ones are, close to 4. But basically you're looking at the ratio of the number of organisms of a species to the total number of organisms in the entire ecosystem. And so if this is a small number compared to this, then overall you'll have a lot of these to add up, and then you'll get a bigger H. Okay, we don't really care so much in this class about that, but I just thought it was interesting. But what we do care about are the roles. Species play different roles, and that goes into that niche conversation that we've been having. And the first role that I want to talk about is the most important role, and that is the keystone species. A keystone species is the one that the whole ecosystem depends on, and it may be more than one. You may have like a little triumvirate, for instance, but ultimately, if you lose any of these keystone species, you lose the ecosystem as a whole. And my first example is the prairie dog. Look at that little adorable guy or girl. Prairie dogs are keystone species to the grasslands where we live, right? Their burrows can provide homes for all sorts of ground-dwelling animals. When they're digging their burrows, they aerate the soil. They actually garden, for better lack of lack of anything better. The way that they forage will actually allow for the vegetation that grows there that's successful, and all of this enriched vegetation that grows because of their activities will attract lots and lots of wildlife. So they're really great in maintaining the grasslands itself, but also they're low on the food chain, so lots of things eat them, including the endangered Blackfoot ferret, right? And the Blackfoot ferret is in fact endangered because the populations of prairie dogs are being exterminated by us, actually, because ranchers don't like them, because cows step in prairie dog burrows and break their little legs, large legs, as the case may be, and they tear stuff up. I mean, they dig around, so people don't like them. But they're really, really important. So it's important that we learn to actually live with them, because if we don't live with them, we won't have the ecosystem to live in. So, just to review, a keystone species is one that occupies the base level of feeding pyramid, is the most common species in an ecosystem, is the largest species in an ecosystem, is one whose removal would upset the populations within the ecosystem, is the type of animal from Pennsylvania, because that is the keystone state. It is not number 5. Sometimes it is going to be the largest species. It depends, right? Sometimes it's also one of the most common. Sometimes it's at the base of the feeding pyramid. But the bottom line is this. it doesn't matter. It's the one that the whole ecosystem relies on. And here's some other examples. Elephants, they maintain the grasslands. They're the big grazers. So in this case, you do have one that's the largest. Look at that little cutie. That is a sea otter. Sea otters are actually part of a kind of triumvirate, right, if you will, of keystone species. It's the sea otter because they keep the urchins in check, and the urchins keep the kelp in check, right? And so the kelp is what is basically the trees of the kelp forest. It's the giant algae. So sea otters keep urchin in check, urchin keep kelp in check. So you need all of those. If you lose the sea otter, the urchins will eat all the kelp. If you lose the urchins, then the sea otters will die, and anything that eats those and urchins will also die. All right, beavers. Beavers are really, really important. Beaver ponds actually are these amazing engineered habitats. Beavers are incredible engineers, but they provide, beavers actually make the habitat that all of these wetland animals actually live in. And about almost half of the endangered species in the United States, we find them in beaver ponds. And when we start blowing those beaver ponds up, removing them, then we lose those habitats. All right, so indicator species are the next thing we want to talk about. They're kind of like the canary in the coal mine. If you don't know what that means, you can either ask me in class or look it up later. But these are organisms. Oftentimes they're microorganisms or plants. Also amphibians are really important indicator species. Fish too. Okay, so there's lots of other things. But they're the ones that let us know what the environmental conditions are because they have narrow ranges of tolerance. A lot of times they're keystone species, but not always. So indicator species and keystone species are not related. Those concepts are not related. You have a species that could be an indicator species. You have a species that could be a keystone species. A species can be both, but it doesn't matter the relationship there because there isn't one. Okay, frogs, amphibians, are great indicator species, right? Because they live in the water, so they're subject to all these water pollutions. They diffuse gases through their integument, their skin, and so they also have pretty narrow ranges of tolerance. You find a lot of deformities in amphibians, extra limbs, malformed limbs, sometimes they're not even there, facial malformations, right? And this has actually been documented in most of the states in the United States. And so it's a huge problem. It's letting us know that we're having environmental issues. Okay, so trout are also an excellent indicator species because they are responsible for, tolerant to, sensitive to, unaffected by changes in water quality. Well, if you think about what an indicator species is, they are sensitive to changes in water quality. That lets us know when small changes occur. So, how about other indicator species? Salmon, the spotted owl, lichen, and then I have a whole list of seabed species in your PowerPoint. This is actually a link to a list some other place. Now, why should you actually care about ecosystems? I mean, isn't it great if we just do whatever we want, we have food, whenever, and we just go in, build houses, all that stuff? Well, it actually turns out that ecosystems are really important. They provide lots of benefits and services. Ecological services. First of all, lots of biodiversity means lots of genetic diversity. High complexity equals high stability, right? If you have all of those things, you'll have really good active nutrient cycling. They help maintain air quality, right? Plants help maintain both of those, air quality and water quality. You have pest control. They're natural predators of things. Climate stabilization. If you have lots of plants taking in CO2, evapotranspiring and all those things, that's great. You get these little microclimates. Pollination. Your pollinators are going to come from wild ecosystems. And also, remember, think about wetlands. You have prevention and mitigation of natural disasters. Roots hold mud to get in, right? And so you don't have mudslides and landslides. Trees help buffer the wind. They help protect, they help break up the wind. Wow, sorry, I didn't know what I was saying there. They help break up wind, right? Wetlands absorb incoming water from storms and stuff. So we know all of these things. So I've put this slide in here for you. There are some indirect services and there are direct services. Please make sure that you know at least one of each of these and examples of one of each of these, okay? Okay, so what's in it for us? We eat a lot of food, right? About 20 plants provide about 80% of our food. That wasn't always true. And so as we start monoculture, which we're talking about later on, as we started to do monoculture, we lost a lot of that variety, but we can get it back in the wild, okay? Medicines, pharmaceuticals, lots and lots of medicines are either directly from other species or they are synthesized versions of something we got from another species. Cosmetics, perfumes, a lot of the actual pigment in cosmetics and stuff, paints, all of those things. When you talk about that, there are really two main sources: rocks, minerals, right? You grind them up, like lead makes red, things like that. But also insects. You can grind up the carapaces of insects, the exoskeleton. You can get lots of really pretty pigments that way. So again, ecosystems, fibers, right? Wood for paper, threads, fabrics, right? You have all of this hair from mammals, and you have skins and things like that, and plants, plant fibers. Glues, resins, dyes, waxes, pesticides, lubricants, all of those things that we need to make all of the industrial stuff go. Yeah. And then construction materials, wood, right? We build lots of things with wood. So we get stuff from ecosystems, is what I'm trying to say here. And then also, there are nice things like more cultural things, aesthetic things. We get ornamental plants and animals and pets and stuff. Again, we have that genetic diversity for breeding stocks. We can bring in some genetic diversity from the wild. Cultural values, right? Nature inspires us to be creative. We can do research so we can learn about the world around us. It's also fun to take a hike in the woods, to go boating, to go fishing, whatever. And then future resources are in these ecosystems. We have to have these ecosystems maintained. That is stability. And of course, we get all of these things that we're talking about, that they provide money, right? They are saleable goods, if you will. So when we talk about biodiversity loss, right, what causes that? Habitat degradation, right? The number one cause of biodiversity loss is habitat degradation and loss. Exploitation is a problem. Hunting, fishing, poaching, collection, right? Collection really goes to plants and invertebrates, stuff like that. Pollution, deforestation, agriculture. We cut down wild ecosystems to build cropland. Cities, we build on it, right? Mining, we tear it up. Recreation, we are not the best in terms of keeping our recreation areas clean. Tourism. Water diversion, we use it, we take it away, we put it in other places, and we introduce other species to ecosystems that screw it up. Plus, we set fires, or we allow fires that are not healthy fires. And we'll talk about that later on too. Okay, so biodiversity loss, I'm going to tell you the primary cause is habitat loss. Habitat loss. Habitat loss. And if you look at the number of species and populations, right, you'll see that as we increase, species go down. All right, so review. What is the greatest threat to wild species populations? Habitat loss, hunting, non-native species, or predation? Habitat loss is number one. Number one is habitat loss. Hunting, overhunting, poaching, overcollection, overfishing, that is number two. That's the second greatest threat. And invasive species is the third greatest threat. Okay, and then predation, that's part of the natural system. So that's not even an answer here. All right. Now, we will talk more about endangered species later on, but I want to talk now about some of the legislation that helps protect biodiversity. Our conversation centered around endangered species, we'll talk about what makes them endangered, what are the characteristics that make species subject or vulnerable to extinction, how can we restore those populations, stuff like that. But let's talk about legislation. The first thing is an international treaty that I want to talk about is called CITES. It was the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And basically it says that you can't trade things that are extinct except in special circumstances, and that has to get approved. They don't have to be endangered, right? But they can be threatened or vulnerable. And it includes a country, any country. So like if it's protected here, but it's not protected someplace else, it still can't be traded because it is protected here. Yeah. So that's the three big components. Then the one thing that we have here in our country is the Endangered Species Act. And I will tell you, this is a great one to know, because when you have to come up with legislation for stuff like the AP exam, if you're talking about biodiversity in any way, it's probably likely that Endangered Species Act is going to be a good go-to, yeah. But basically, it develops a list of the species that are endangered and threatened. It prohibits doing anything with them without some sort of license or permission or whatever, and it allows for the protection of their habitat. So, makes a list of who's endangered, prohibits any sort of interference with those animals, and protects their land. Big, big deal. Okay, in the United States, most habitat destruction occurs in the interest of what? Well, real estate development is one that we like to say because that's what we see because we live in the city, but really it's agriculture. If you get outside the city, you'll see farm after farm after farm after farm, and that used to be wild habitat. But we have a real problem. We need to grow enough food to support our population, but we also need to maintain wild habitat. So the question becomes, how do we do that? All right. Now, I just want to show you some species that benefited from the Endangered Species Act. These are our success stories, and that is the bald eagle, which is our national symbol. We had actually gotten down to just above 400 in pairs, so about 800 of them. And the whooping crane was down to like 54. I will tell you that UT Southwestern and parts of Dallas are actually protected because there is a population of whooping cranes that live here in Dallas, and so you can't hunt them, you can't shoot them, you can't do anything in their habitats because they're protected in the Endangered Species Act. The peregrine falcon, they've actually moved into cities, they're thriving, they're doing a really good job. The gray wolf, right? We've had to reintroduce those into places because we made them go extinct. The gray whale, right? It's actually been removed from the list, which is a success story. The grizzly bear, that was removed from the list as well in 2007 because their population had come back. And then the sea otter that we just talked about as being a keystone species, that is endangered, but it's coming back. It's getting better, but it's still endangered. And then the red wolf, right, which is what your discussion question was about, was down to 17 and then is up to right around 300, I think, now. But anyway, that's still on the list as well. Okay, and then your question is, although the whooping crane continues to increase in numbers from the low of 14 cranes in 1939, the species still faces a number of obstacles. Which of the following is probably the greatest obstacle to full recovery? There are no nesting sites for adult birds. There's still plenty of hazards along migratory routes. There's very low genetic variation in the species. The continued use of DDT, which thins eggshells, is reducing their eggs, or ultralight aircraft fly into migrating birds. There are nesting sites because they're protected under the Endangered Species Act. There are plenty of hazards along migratory routes, but remember, they are protected, and so you can't hunt them or get in their way. DDT is banned in the United States. We'll talk about that later on. It also affected the bald eagle, but again, we'll talk about that later on. Sometimes planes do fly into migratory birds, right? But again, they're protected under the Endangered Species Act. The one thing that you can't protect them from is low genetic variation, right? And it's vital that species do not fall below the critical number because there is a certain number of individuals above which genetic variation is enough that you get healthy individuals. Below that number, you start to have inbreeding issues, and this is something we'll talk about more when we talk about rescuing endangered species. So anyway, the answer is 3. Anyway, that's it for this conversation, and I will see you next time. If you have any questions, please ask me in class, and thanks for listening.